Testing.
Hello, hello. Yep.
Okay, good.
Just finishing up the YouTube starting.
Did you receive my text, Rabbi, with my ideas and follow up from the leadership training?
Yes, about services and such. Yes, so we can definitely talk about that.
Perfect. That's a nice place. I like that place.
Yeah, Pearlstone is very nice.
Very nice. People complain about the food. I thought it was fine. I enjoy. I ate everything.
It's not a 5-star hotel, but the food was always fine when I was there. But that was 13 years ago. But I mean,
I don't know the food that you eat at home. For me, that was fine. Like, food is food.
Yeah. It's, like I said, some people are expecting, the 5-star Michelin, cuisine stuff, but no, the food is good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, was decent.
Let me just get this set up. All right. So let's go ahead and get down to work. So first of all, I have to apologize for the bait and switch. During my sabbatical, I was studying up on Nida, and in the process, I realized, we'd probably be better served to begin with Mikvaot first. And
we changed the Mishnah. We are not studying the. Oh, I bought already that Mishnah.
We'll get to Nida. We'll get to Nida later, but I wanted to start with Mikvaot because we're going to be talking about the mikvah in Nida, and for many people, mikvah is a more familiar yet strange concept. So we're going to begin with Mikvaot, and then we'll follow up with Nida as number 2. But hopefully people will find this both interesting, relevant, and it's going to, I think, set a lot of the groundwork for what we're going to be talking about when we get into to Nida. So like I said, I apologize for the bait and switch, but this just seemed like a better start for diving in, if you'll pardon the pun, into this section of the Mishnah. So we're going to start off with Dr. Kulp's introduction, because there are a number of points that I want to get on the table before we look into the detail. As always, the Mishnah was not written in a systematic introduction of a topic and then point A, B, and then expanding on A, B. It's written in a way that will remind students who have already studied this with their teachers. And so that means we have to do a little background information before diving in. So Dr. Kulp's introduction is an excellent one. So let's go ahead and run through it. Today, most people are familiar with the mikveh, usually translated as a ritual bath. In modern halakha, it is mostly used for conversion and by women immersing after their menstrual period. Some men also have a custom of going to the mikveh, but that is more as a custom. And we'll talk about, as we go through, some of the different customs and practices, and also some of the other halakhic reasons for using a mikveh, as well as its actual construction. Most people are not all that familiar with the laws of the mikveh, which can be quite complicated. This is the topic of our tractate. What exactly constitutes a mikveh, and who needs to immerse in a mikveh in order to become pure? So yes, that means we're going to be talking about tuma and tahara, about impurity and purity. And I always want to just give that little reminder to everyone, when we're talking about pure and impure, or clean and unclean, as it is often translated into English, we are not talking about physical filth. We are not talking about germs. We are not talking about biology at all. That will become very apparent as we go through just what we do tonight, let alone our ongoing discussion. We are talking about a ritual status that a person has, which changes their relationship to other ritual activities within Judaism. We'll come back to these topics as we go through, but I just want to make sure that anyone who thinks that just because we are using water to remove ritual impurity, that somehow this has any relationship to using a bath to remove dirt, or a bath to or washing hands to remove germs or bacteria, that this is not the case. This is not a medical and this is not a hygienic activity. This is a ritual one. Now, just because it's ritual doesn't mean, well, it's only ritual. It is still an important part of Jewish belief. It is an important part of Jewish practice, and it should not be considered less important simply because it doesn't have a biological or more physical activity going along with it. And we'll talk about those different reasons for mikveh as we go through, and then even more so when we get into Nida following this Masechet. Dr. Kolb continues. The Torah states that a Zav, a person who has had an abnormal genital discharge, must, and this is from Genesis 15, bathe his body in fresh water, then he shall be clean. Indeed, the word that's used for fresh water is mayim chayim. This is a word we're going to come back to again and again, and it can get a little confusing because there is the technical term used throughout this Masechet, and then there is the generic term that is used in many modern usages. It literally means living water, but as Dr. Kolb writes, the fresh water is understood as a living stream. In Hebrew, a mayan. Now, we're going to talk about exactly what the technical term mayim chayim means, what a mayan, what a Hebrew for spring water means. And spring water here, we don't mean something bottled up and sold in a vending machine. We mean water connected physically to the spring from which it has sprung. So those are going to be very important distinctions, as we will find out. In contrast, people with other forms of impurity, meaning anyone not a Zav, must only bathe his whole body in water. This is taken from Leviticus 15. This latter requirement is understood to be bathing in a mikveh. That is to say, in the, quote, ritual bath that, if you are familiar at all, you have seen in synagogues and Jewish institutions. We shall talk throughout this tractate about what differentiates a mikveh from a mayan, a living stream, how large a mikveh must be, and how the water must get into the mikveh. Very important concept. For now, I will merely quote the verses below that refer to what the rabbis call a mikveh. We shall reference these as we continue to learn. And as he says, good luck. So Leviticus 11:31, those are for you the unclean among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. Again, unclean, ritually impure, tameh. And anything on which one of them falls when dead shall be unclean, be it an article of wood or a cloth or a skin or a sack, any such article that can be put to use shall be dipped in water, and it shall remain unclean until evening, then it shall be clean. So this idea of tevilah, of immersing an object into water in order to render it clean from its state of ritual impurity, is laid out there in 11:31. Leviticus 15 goes on to say, when one with a discharge becomes clean of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes and bathe his body in fresh water, mayim chayim. You'll notice the different usage of the word there. Then he shall be clean. When a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain unclean until evening. And in Numbers 31, this is the ritual law that the Lord has enjoined upon Moses. Gold and silver, copper, iron, tin, and lead, any article that can withstand fire, these you shall pass through fire, and they shall be clean, except that they must be cleansed with water of lustration, and anything that cannot withstand fire, you must pass through water. Indeed, this is also hopefully reminding you of our discussion of kashrut, as this is one of the source texts for how we decide how to make different items kosher. Now, we need to get one more text that he did not quote, which is further on in chapter 11, which is verse 34. And as it goes on to say, as to any food that may be eaten, it shall become impure if it came into contact with water. As to any liquid which may be drunk, it shall become impure if it was inside a vessel. So he's talking here about this idea that the water will begin the process of potentially contaminating with ritual impurity. Again, a topic we've discussed before, especially in Netilat Yadayim with the washing of hands. Everything on which the carcass of any of them falls shall be impure. An oven or stove shall be smashed. They are impure, and impure they shall remain for you. However, a spring or a cistern. Here we have a mayan, that's a spring, or a cistern, that's a bore. That's like a hollowed out part of the ground in which water is stored as a storage tank, in which water is collected, shall be pure. Indeed, you can see this is a mikveh mayim, right? This is the water is collected there, yihye tahor, it will be pure. But whoever touches such a carcass, in it shall be impure. So this is letting us know that water that is in one of these collected vessels, this mikveh, whether it be a mayan or whether it be a bore, the water that is in those, as we'll see if they have been made correctly, though that water remains ritually pure, even if there is a carcass of something that generally creates ritual impurity. So you drop the carcass of a sheretz, for example, a creepy crawly kind of thing, and it goes into one of these mikveh, into one of the either a spring or a cistern. The carcass is still a source of ritual impurity if you pull it out, but the water inside cannot become ritually impure. That's going to be very important as we go through this Masechet to understand the impermeability, the non-contaminatable nature of the water of a mikveh, and ensuring that the vessel, the creation, vessel is the wrong word, the creation of the space for the mikveh will be done in a way that allows it to retain the properties Torah is describing here in chapter 11, that the water in it will always remain pure. So that is the overall goal of this Masechet, to both describe to describe those places that either naturally or artificially have been created, and to ensure that they remain in a status that will allow them to perform this function, which is to say, they themselves cannot become impure, but that which is in them will become pure. Okay, so now before we get into 1.1, are there any questions with that introduction? Bearing in mind, of course, we will be uncovering a lot of things as we go. So I'm not going to explain all of the Masechet tonight, because that's the job over the next weeks. All right, so let's dive in with 1.1. And 1.1, surprisingly, thankfully, actually begins with something like a systematic opening, which is to say it's going to give us the 6 degrees of different mikvaot. So you'll notice that in that verse from chapter 11, where we talked about the mayanot and the mikvaot, these springs and these bores, the cisterns that have collected water, that they will render things pure and not be made impure. But it probably was already beginning to spin in your mind, well, exactly how big does a spring need to be, and what does the spring look like, and what about a cistern? What counts? Well, as we're going to see, this definition of mikveh here in the beginning of chapter 1 is using the broadest definition. We are not describing the purpose-built structure that is put into many synagogues and Jewish institutions that meet all of the criteria that this Masechet will cover. We are instead talking about anything that has collected water in it that might be considered a natural collection point. So we're really going to be talking about from puddles all the way up to the natural spring lakes. And we're going to look through different degrees of what those collection points might mean for issues of purity and impurity. So let's start with the lowest degree, because as we're going to see, there are 6 degrees of mikvaot, each superior to the other. So we know we're going to have 6 levels eventually, and we're going to start with the lowest levels. The water of pools, in brackets, implied smaller than 40 seah. If an unclean person drank of it, bum, bum, bum. All right, so let's get the explanation of what we're doing here. So the water of pools smaller than 40 seah, as we will see later, in which the Mishnah assumes you already know, because of course you've read everything before coming back to review. A kosher mikvah is going to need to be, by and large, 40 seahs. Now that is about 150, 200 gallons. There's some argument and debate. Most modern man-built mikvaot are around 200 gallons at least. This is a relatively large space. In fact, it has an official measure or an official source of that measure, which is to say this 40 seah measurement comes from the size of a person that is being immersed. It is an amah by an amah, that is to say an amah wide and an amah long, and 3 amot deep. Now, an amah is about 18 inches, and this is considered to be the sort of box-like space that an average person would up. If you were going to make the the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo da Vinci, where he has the man inside of the circle and inside the box. Well, ours isn't 2D, ours is 3D. That you go 18 inches left and right, and you go 18 inches front and back as being roughly the standing footprint of a person. And then you go up to about 5 feet for the height of a person, if they are maybe a crouching or just in the ancient world, sort of average of height. That is a cube, or sorry, not a cube, but a prism space that if you were to fill that imaginary space with water, would take up about 40 seah, or about 200 gallons in the modern measurements, well, modern imperial measurements. So if you have that full amount, then you are in a different category. But what about our natural water gathering, a puddle in a rock that is smaller than that? What is the status? What happens from that? Because the Torah said that these natural water gatherings are pure. And that is true, meaning that the water in that gathering is pure. But the Mishnah is not worried about that, because that's obvious. The Mishnah is worried about the interaction of that water with somebody that is not pure. Obviously, it's smaller than the person, so they cannot use it to make themselves ritually pure. But can they change the status of that small amount of water, that less than 40 seahs? And as we're going to see, the answer is yes. So, backing up again now with that additional explanation, the water of pools smaller than 40 seah, this is the lowest level of mikvah. If an unclean person drank of it, and then a clean person drank of it, he, meaning clean person number 2, becomes unclean. You have to imagine that you have a depression in stone. It's along the side of a trail, and you have somebody coming along and drinking from it, and that person is ritually impure. Maybe they buried a loved one. We don't need to know. They're ritually impure. They bend down into the hollow, and they put their lips against the water and drink from the water. Well, now that they have drunk from that water, a second person gets in line, they bend down and drink, that second person becomes ritually impure. So what is happening here, according to the rabbinic understanding of this interaction between the clean water, the impure person, and then the pure person that comes after them, is that water remains pure, but when the person drank from it who was ritually impure, as they are retracting from the surface of the water, as they are pulling their lips up, there is going to be some drippage from themselves and the water. Because they have drunk from it purposefully, because they have drunk from it with intention to use, it now becomes susceptible to ritual impurity, as we talked about from the earlier quote from Dr. Kolb's introduction. Thus, when it drips back off of them, it is taking its new status as being ritually impure because it came in contact with their lips. And that means there is now 2 types of water in that puddle. There is the water that is still ritually pure for being in the puddle before it was in contact with that person's face. And there is the drippage, the spillage off that ritually impure person that puts it back into the water, and it is now commingled. And as we will see from our discussion extensively, but I'll give you the short version now, because this pool of water is neither flowing and being refilled from a natural source, nor is it beyond the 40 seah minimum amount, that new introduction of ritually impure water is considered to remain ritually impure in that hollow of the stone, and thus the second person is presumed to have quite possibly drunk from that ritually impure water, rendering themselves ritually impure as well. Now, before I get to your question there, Aaron, let me just draw your attention to the fact that clearly we are not talking about hygiene here, because they are literally drinking out of a pool of water that is in the rock, just collected from whatever, in the middle of nowhere. Not many people are going to tell you, put your lips down against a random puddle and have a drink. I'm sure it's fine. However, we're not talking here about whether the water is safe for your digestion or whether there are parasites in it or anything else. We're only talking about purity and impurity. And in this case, that second person will be considered ritually impure after having drunk from it. Now for your question, Aaron.
Why is drinking the thing that makes it impure, not just touching it?
So excellent question, because that topic's going to come up for a number of the cases that we are about to come across. That you need to actually have an intention to use the water in order for the water to then become susceptible to that ritual impurity. That if you were to walk through the puddle, even though you were ritually impure, you would not transfer your impurity to the water. So that means that if the ritually impure person walks through this puddle, and then the ritually pure person after them stops, bends down, and drinks in the puddle that the other guy just stepped in, that's perfectly fine. However, if the first person, the ritually impure, stops in the puddle and tries to wash their shoes with it, then by rinsing their shoes with that water intentionally, they have now made use of it, removing it from its natural state into its usable state, and thus it becomes a vessel for impurity. And when it spills back into the puddle now becomes mixed between both pure and impure water. So the drinking of it is showing an intentionality, it is showing kavanah, it is showing a deliberate activation of a natural water into a usable water, and that once it makes that transition, it becomes susceptible to impurity.
So does the water actually have to drip back into the puddle, or if you use like a vessel or something to wash our hands where it doesn't drip back in, is it still impure?
Excellent question, and that's going to come up in just a minute. So we're going to talk about drawing the water out with a vessel, but right now we're just talking about lips to the surface. So hold on, and if the Mishnah doesn't answer the question, then remind me, and I'll go back and cover it more explicitly. All right, so let's continue on here with Mishnah 1. If an unclean person drank of it and then drew water from it in a clean vessel, the vessel becomes unclean. So here we have a second version. We still have the unclean person acting. They lean down, they slurp the water from the surface, and then they take out their thermos or something else, and they have now a clean vessel, presumably a vessel that would remain clean in other circumstances, and they immerse it in the water that they have just drunk from. Well, since that water is now considered to be of mixed status, that vessel now becomes considered ritually unclean. Now, again, we're not saying that the vessel definitively came into contact or not. This is a rabbinic understanding of how we are going to treat the circumstance. We are not getting down and tagging different molecules to know whether it came from him or not from him. But if this is the situation, then this is the ruling. So that that clean vessel then becomes contaminated by that water. Again, the water inside does not necessarily become nullified, as Dr. Kolb explains. And then the third situation, which is we're going to repeat these 1, 2, 3 situations with some variations in just a minute, but let's get our third version here. If an unclean person drank of it, and then a loaf of truma fell in it, okay, what's the ruling? Well, remember, a loaf of truma, anything that is truma, has to remain ritually pure in order for it to be ritually pure. And if it ceases to be ritually pure, then it is now no longer truma. So what happens? He's already slurped, but then the loaf falls in. If he washed his hands in it, it becomes unclean. But if he did not wash his hands in it, it continues to be clean. Now, this is actually one version of how to understand this Mishnah. So I'm going to read Dr. Kolb's explanation, and then I'm going to give you the alternative explanation that other commentaries have as well. In this case, a loaf of bread falls in, and then someone takes it out. If the person who took it out first washes his hands off in the water, then his hands are unclean, and he will defile the loaf. If, however, he does not wash his hands off, then the loaf remains clean. The reason is a bit complicated. The water in the pool can become impure until it has been removed from the pool, as we said, being chosen to be used. When he removes this water, the clean water is greater in quantity than the unclean water, and therefore the unclean water is nullified. In this case, we don't say that the unclean water defiles the clean water, as we said in section 2, because we hold that unclean water has been absorbed by the loaf. Since this water cannot be seen, it is considered to be nullified by the clean water. I realize this is complicated. Just remember, I didn't write it. Now, an alternative commentary that I've also come across for this particular section is saying that it's not a question of whether he washed his hands or not. It's a question of whether or not he washed the loaf. That if he actually uses the water to clean the loaf, then indeed it is now in a used state, and as such it becomes susceptible as a vehicle for transmission of ritual impurity, and as such it can make the loaf unclean. But on the other hand, if he did not wash the loaf, if the loaf is not being deliberately rinsed in this water, it just fell in, got soggy, and is removed, then the water is no longer being considered in that used form, and as such, it is not a vehicle for transmission or contamination. All right, now we're going to repeat that pattern in a couple different variations. So we'll come back to that idea a couple times. Mishnah 2. If one drew water from it in an unclean vessel, and then a clean person drank out of the pit, he becomes unclean. All right, same issue as we had in number 1, except here, rather than me putting my lips to the water, I am taking an object which is ritually impure and dipping it into the water to take the water out. But the same problem arises. As I am pulling the vessel out of the water is going to also drop off of that vessel. And since the vessel itself is unclean, then yes, it will be mingling with the water. And then when person number 2 drinks out of it, they will also become unclean. Likewise, if one drew water from it in an unclean vessel and then drew water from it in a clean vessel, it becomes unclean, parallel to as we saw in Mishnah 1. And if one drew water from it in an unclean vessel and a loaf of truma fell in, if he washed in it, it becomes unclean. But if he did not wash his hand in it, it is clean. So it's exactly parallel, even though he's using a vessel, because the vessel is unclean, it still has the same contaminatory effect. And I really apologize. I have not come up with a good English word other than contamination. Transmission can also work. I know that has a very negative term in English, but please try to see this clinically. It's not a question of being clean is good and unclean is bad. Like we've talked about before, there are very noble and indeed commanded reasons to become unclean. Indeed, the most important being the taking care of somebody who is deceased. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, I noticed you keep bringing up the dropping back in the water, and in the previous Mishnah, it says that the water does not become unclean until the bread was removed. Does that have anything to do with dripping the water back into the water?
Yes, and exactly right. If the loaf just fell in, its status is static. It does not change. It has to have that drawing forth activity for it to become susceptible to impurity. Now, if you're thinking ahead, or if you've read ahead, or if you know more about Mikvaot than we've already talked about, that may be stirring some thoughts of maybe that's why when we fill a mikvah, we don't use drawn water. We don't use water that's been pulled out of a natural source. And if you're thinking along those lines, you're on the right track. We're going to cover that in later chapters. But this drawing or not drawing, this removing of water from a clean source and what happens to it afterwards, that's going to be a very big deal. All right, let's see if we can get Mishnah 3 down. If unclean water fell into it and a clean person drank of it, he becomes unclean. So here we've removed the first drinker. We've removed the drawing vessel. Here we have water that is unclean. It's a jug, and I'm not even dipping the jug in. I'm just pouring the water into this puddle. But the water in that jug is ritually impure. Maybe it was in an open vessel inside of a tent when somebody passed away. Whatever the reason is, the water is ritually impure, and I am pouring it into this small puddle. And then the clean person drinks from it. They are ritually unclean. Same rules as we've applied so far consistently. If unclean water fell into it, and then water was drawn from it in a clean vessel, it becomes unclean. Same as before. If unclean water fell into it and a loaf of truma fell in, if he washed in it, it becomes unclean. But if he did not wash in it, it is clean. Now, Rabbi Shimon wants to throw a wrinkle. He says it becomes unclean whether he washed in it or whether he did not wash in it. And it turns out that Rabbi Shimon does not win this argument. Okay. Questions on Mishnah 4. This is still following on very parallel to all of the previous Mishnayot. And now we're going to get into, well, let's just say it's a little icky. I'm trying to just line that up. There we go. If a corpse fell into it, or an unclean person walked in it, and a clean person drank of it, he is clean. All right. What in the world is going on here? How could it be that just because my friend, who's a Zav, sucked a little water out of the puddle, that if I drink out of the puddle, I become unclean? But if there is literally a dead person, or my friend just walks through it, as I mentioned, it's not unclean for me to drink out of it. This seems so counterintuitive. And that is because you have been infected by modern germ theory. Now, don't get me wrong, modern germ theory and the modern biological sciences that have led to medicine and our ability to fight infectious diseases of all type are miracles of the modern day, and I wish our people had spent more time thinking about them in the past in order to come up with them. But that is different than this. I know we are used to the whole idea that there is contaminated water and there's something in it. That is a relatively modern concept, and one which is very useful for medicine and science, and one that is not useful for thinking about mikvaot, or purity and impurity in general. So let's walk through why this is the case. Here we have this body, a corpse, and it goes into the water. Well, while it's in the water still remains clean, because the water in that natural form of a vessel, that's still the wrong word because kli has a different connotation than Hebrew, that naturally formed container, hollow. We need more words in English. It's got the biggest vocabulary, but we still find like I'm running out. in that naturally formed depression, the body is still in it, meaning the rest of the water around it is still ritually pure. Now, if I were to take the water out, rinse the body, and then that water was to fall back in, then yes, because I've drawn it, it becomes susceptible to impurity. It becomes impure in its contact with the body. It goes back into the water, and now we have the problem we've been discussing. But as long as the thing which is impure remains in it, and even if it is withdrawn, if it wasn't withdrawn with intention, but like the foot of the unclean person walking through it with the purpose of using the water, it means the rest of the water retains all of its normal purity status. And that means that, yes, as counterintuitive as it seems to a modern person, drinking from a cistern of natural water that has a body at the bottom of it does not render you ritually impure. Okay, if I didn't break your mind, let's continue on with the rest of Mishnah 4. The same rule applies to water of pools, the water of cisterns, the water of ditches, the water of caverns, the water of rain flows which have stopped, and mikvahs of less than 40 seahs. So throughout all of this, the same rule applies, that even if there is a body in it, it is still considered to be a ritually clean water to drink from or to use in other ways. And all of the other rules that we have talked about of, just drinking from it when you are unclean and then the next person, or using an unclean vessel to draw from it, etc. All of those rules apply no matter which type of water depression, hollow cistern you're using, as long as they are all in this less than 40 seahs. Now, as he points out here, we are talking about 126 gallons. That's on the low end of the estimate. I've seen goes all the way up to 200 gallons. Most modern mikvaot that are purpose-built are much larger than that. They are usually like quite large jacuzzis. So all of that applies that we've talked about so far only to containers that are less than that size. Now, we're going to add in another wrinkle in the second half here of Mishnah 4. They are all clean during the time of rain. So the question that might be crossing your mind is, well, wait a minute. All of these little bodies of water that we've been talking about, are they pure or are they not pure when I come across to them? How do I know who's been sucking from the water or who's not been sucking from the water? Well, if it is during the time of rain, then the general supposition is that all the water that you find is considered to be rainwater that is nullifying anything else that might have been in there, and therefore you do not need to worry about it. Now, if you see somebody that is ritually impure right in front of you, drink from it, then you're back to the problems of Mishnahs 1, 2, and 3. But if you're just walking around in the middle of the mountains and you come across a puddle of water that's less than 40 seahs, if it's during the time of rain, you don't need to worry about who's been possibly drinking from it. You can assume that it is considered ritually pure. However, when the rain has stopped, those near to a city or to a road are unclean, and those distant remain clean until the majority of people pass that way. So if you are walking along the road and you come across one of these large puddles, but not too large, remember, because then the status is going to change, you can consider it to be impure because people use this area and it's not being constantly replenished and changed with the rainwater, and therefore chances are this has become ritually impure. And if you drink from it, which you are still allowed to do, provided you're not one of the few categories of people that need to remain ritually pure at those particular moments, you should now understand that you have the status as being ritually impure, and thus you will need to do ritual purification in some other manner. So the lesson that we're getting here from the second half of Mishnah 4 is that these puddles need to be understood according to the likely status that they have. Again, this is a leniency that the rabbis are putting in place to counteract a bit of the stringency that they also put in place. The Torah itself says that the water in these naturally gathered sources is ritually pure. The rabbis, however, are cautious because of the likelihood that someone who was ritually impure has mingled the waters. Therefore, we will treat them according to the likelihood that that has occurred. If I see the person ritually impure doing it, then I know that I can't use it, or I can't consider it to be ritually clean. If I don't see the person, but I'm just traveling, then I will make a judgment call based upon the likelihood. If it's rainy time, then they're all constantly being refilled. I'm perfectly fine. If it's not rain time, then if it's near where people travel, then chances are someone has drunk from this or drawn from it with an impure vessel. And if I'm in the middle of nowhere, then yeah, probably I can still trust this water to be remaining ritually impure or ritually pure if it's really out in the boondocks. Yes, sir.
Since the issue is people passing, if it's on private property, can it be presumed to be pure still?
If it's on private property that nobody is using, then perhaps. But if it's on private property where, you know, the farmer is out there, the shepherd is out there, the family is out there, then you would assume that since it's not being constantly replenished by rain in this section of Mishnah 4, that the person who owns the property has probably used it, even if not just travelers. So it's more about, is it likely to be in more or less normal usage? And if it's in an accessible part of someone's property, then the assumption would be that the owner of the property has used it. And chances are at different times that person has been ritually impure. Again, as always, being ritually impure is not wrong. Sometimes we're even commanded to do it. So chances are lots of people were. Now, I should just give a little bit of a background because I love history and I like using the opportunity to share that not every Jewish person at all times has had that same view. If you go back to the time of the late Second Temple, meaning around the transition from BCE to CE, there were a group of people known as the Essenes or the Qumran community, maybe the same, maybe not, but we do know that the people of Qumran and the people described as Essenes had a extreme fixation with ritual purity and were constantly using mikvaot in order to retain themselves as being ritually pure at all times that they possibly could. That is an extreme opinion and one that is not normative within Judaism. That was a sect. You could even go so far as to perhaps call it a cult. Those are the people who, by the way, were most likely the creators of what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you read through some of their non-Tanakh work, their own community work, you get a very clear interpretation of this. If you look at the archaeology of their community, you will see mikvaot in abundance, and in many of the ways that it was clearly being created are ratified in, we see in this Masechet, but their constant use definitely seems to be off the deep end for what normative Judaism was doing. Likewise, throughout history, you will occasionally get different communities that will have an ebb and flow, and I really do apologize for all the water puns, but they're almost unstoppable, that there'll be an ebb and flow of people who become more or less fixated on ritual purity beyond the actual measure of the law, where they will be going to the mikveh almost daily, if not multiple times each day, for a variety of reasons and conceptions. Some because of actual physical concerns of ritual purity and impurity, some because of spiritual concerns. We'll talk about that more as we go through the Masechet. All right, and Mishnah 5 is going to round out our small puddles. When do they become clean? Right? We've been talking about all of these small puddles, and we've been talking about them becoming a source of ritual impurity, the person who sips from it that was unclean, the unclean vessel, etc. Well, they can't become ritually impure forever. because the Torah says that these natural collection points are ritually pure. So when do they revert to their natural state? Well, Beit Shammai has what I'm sure some of you will believe is a very logical analysis. Beit Shammai says, when their contents have been increased by more than the original quantity and they overflow. So he puts two conditions. The water has to be doubled more than, meaning if it was at, let's say it was at 20 seahs as a puddle, and it went down to 10, which was unclean, then you've got to put another 10 plus in and cause the this natural collection point to overflow. This does two things. One, you can now be sure that the majority of the water is not unclean, and you can be sure that there is at least a likelihood that any water that was unclean has flowed away in the overflow extra. Beit Hillel disagrees. Beit Hillel says when their contents have been increased by more than the original quantity, even if they do not overflow. So Beit Hillel says, yeah, you got to double the amount plus, so that we actually do know that the majority of the water in that pool did not come from the time when it was rendered ritually impure. But this overflow condition is not necessary. We don't need to concern ourselves with adding in the potential exit of any ritually impure water, because really what we are doing here, as I mentioned, is we are playing with the leniency and stringencies of the stringency that we already added to the Torah itself. As such, it is not the Torah that is making this demand upon us. It is our own rabbinic interpretation, our own rabbinic caution. And because we are the ones who created the caution, we can adjust that level of caution as seems appropriate. Like I said before, it's like if you put up a fence to keep people from falling over a cliff, one person can say we need a fence and we need a sign. The next person can say we only need a fence. That isn't anything to do with the edge of the cliff. That is to do with arguing about how much precaution we need. And as such, it's perfectly fine to take a more lenient or strict view and then try to argue and debate it. Beit Hillel here is saying we need sort of a moderate opinion. That yes, we need to double up the water, but we don't have to worry about the overflow. Rabbi Shimon says when they overflow, although their contents have not been so increased. So Rabbi Shimon is the most lenient opinion, saying that if you went down, in our example, from 20 seahs to 19, and the 19 was rendered ritually impure, if you add just one plus a little so that it overflows from this natural collection point, then that's okay, even though you only added a touch to the water that was rendered ritually impure, or rendered actually as a source of potential contamination that we would be treating as such. So Rabbi Shimon has a very, very low threshold for returning it to that Torah state of it's a natural collection point, it's pure. Beit Hillel wins the argument, and we do follow their ruling that we have to double the content, but we don't need to require an overflow. So even if the amount of the cistern is much, much larger, if there was only a small amount in the bottom that became susceptible to this ritual impurity issue, as long as we double it a little bit, plus a little bit, we're okay. We don't have to refill the entire natural collection point. And now we're going to introduce at the end a new topic. These are valid for preparing dough for challah and for the washing of the hands. So in this circumstance, this water now is okay for making challah, which remember has to actually be ritually pure because a portion of it is being given to the Kohanim, and for the washing of hands for Netilat Yadayim, which we have talked about before. Okay, thank you, Aaron. Question on number 5.
Okay, does modern challah have to be ritually impure since it's burned instead of given to the priest?
No, we will eventually, I'm sure, talk a great deal about the status of human beings in the modern world. But we cannot make ritually pure challah unless you had an underwater stove in a mikveh. I'm trying to think if there's any possible way that you could do so. But we cannot make ritually pure challah in any case, which is why challah is destroyed, because we cannot present it to a kohen. So yes, the modern world is by default considered to be ritually impure, and that is the standard. We'll talk about this and more, but it's just good to get it out there in the beginning so that people can hear it, because we'll be repeating it. Although a mikvah does still render a person ritually pure in the modern world, as soon as you step foot out of the mikvah, you return to a state of ritual impurity. There is simply no way to escape that in modern halakha. We'll talk about that in much more detail as we go through this Masechet. All right, we're just going to have time, I think, yes, to introduce the next type of water, which is to say, we've talked about small puddles. Now we're going to talk about a different type of, well, puddle, kind of. Let's get down as much as we can on the screen at once. Nope, wrong way. So this is Mishnah 6. Superior to such water is the water of rain flows which have not stopped. So here we have rainwater, and that means we have our natural collection point, and there is rainwater that is flowing into that natural collection point. So you are out in the world, there's water pouring in down the hill, and that water is hitting the natural collection point, and you are going to then use that collection point. What is the ruling? Well, I hope you remember what we did in Mishnahs 1, 2, and 3, because we're doing it again. If an unclean person drank of it, and then a clean person drank of it, he is clean. If an unclean person drank of it, and water was then drawn from a clean vessel, it is clean. If an unclean person drank of it, and a loaf of truma fell in it, even if he washed in it, it is clean. So all of these points are the opposite of what we had from our earlier Mishnayot. That here, because the water is being constantly replenished by this pure rainwater, we are not overly concerned with the drippings of the unclean person that drank from it, or the vessel, or anything else. And that means that the next person who comes along and uses it is perfectly fine. And indeed, this follows logically from what we already saw, with the idea that during the rainy season, even smaller puddles are considered to be clean. Certainly one that is being filled with a current flow of water would be held in that same standard. Continuing with the rulings of this rainwatering puddle, if one drew water from it in an unclean vessel, and then a clean person drank out of it, he is clean. If one drew water from it in an unclean vessel, and a loaf of truma fell in it, even if he washed in it, it is clean. If unclean water fell in it, and a clean person drank of it, he is clean. If unclean water fell into it, and one drew water from it in a clean vessel, it is clean. If unclean water fell into it, and a loaf of truma fell in it, even if he washed in it, it is clean. All such water is valid for truma and for the washing of the hands. So again, we get this codicil at the end, that this is absolutely perfectly fine and considered to be ritually pure water, and to be non-contaminatable. It cannot be tainted by any impurity due to this continuous flow that's coming in from the rainwater. Questions or comments about Mishnah 6? So that was number 2 of our hierarchy of types of water puddles.
How can you have a continuous flow of rain? Because it stops raining every once in a while.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when it stops raining, this water collection point, assuming it's under 40 seahs, would go back to being a type number 1. So it can alternate. Certain collection points can alternate between being type 1, when it's just sitting there with water and nothing is pouring into it, And type 2, it's sitting there, but there's water coming down. Now, that rainwater can, happen quite often. It's not as rare, especially here in Florida, as you might think. But yes, it is possible for the water to stop and for the pool to go back to being status number 1. Natan, I see your hand.
Yes, if already the second level is almost impossible to don't be clean. So what's different with the third, fourth, and fifth? The fifth level, it will be all of them the same category. If already the second is already so high.
There's nowhere to go, right? I mean, we've already reached maximum because we've already reached, right? We've already reached a pool of water that we will assume is ritually pure, no matter what happened to it. And that is an excellent question of, well, what happened? What are we going to say about level 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 3, 4, 5, 6? We're going to say a lot. we're not done with any of this, but there are important distinctions about what it can be used for if it is this smaller quantity. And there are important distinctions, like we talked about before, about Mayim Chayim and Mayanot that have a slightly different status than the other forms of 40 seyas and that type of construction. So there is still something important to say about those other levels, but you're absolutely right. And with the time, this is probably a good place to begin wrapping it up, that it's not that hard to create a situation for ritual purity, that both by what the Torah describes, as well as by how the rabbis understand it, and even with the precautions they put on top of it, it's not hard to achieve a quantity of water that will be created in a way, and more on that, of course, throughout the rest of this Masechet, that provides you with a source of ritual purity that is bulletproof, that doesn't wash away, that this mikveh, and using the general term, this collection point, is very useful and valid for most purposes. There are going to be some exceptions, and that's why we're going to need 3, 4, 5, 6. But it's not hard. And that's something to bear in mind, because we often will treat ritual impurity as though it is this incredibly difficult and very impenetrable source of Jewish law and of difficulty in Jewish life. And that's simply not true. That it is very attainable. And as we'll see, it is only needed in certain circumstances, especially in the modern world. And that creating an opportunity for it is not that hard. But we're going to cover that a lot more as we go through our Masechet. But I think we'll leave it here with Mishnah 6 being done, and we'll pick up with Mishnah 7, because that's going to talk about the collection points, which is becoming my new favorite expression, these collection points of level 3 and 4. So we're going to get, it's going to go a little faster from here on out as we talk about our different collection points.
And so we are still in Teorot, correct?
Yes,
Still
yes.
Teorot.
In the Seder, yes.
Okay.
So Rabbi,
yes.
Main difference between 3, 4, 5, and 6 is that in these ones, it's the water that's either pure or impure. And if you get more water in it, then it can start purifying people and objects?
Roughly, yes. But we're going to look at, it's also about exactly how it is maintained and the status of the flow within these different collection points. So yeah, there's a lot more to say, which is why, it's not a short topic. And then eventually, of course, we'll talk about the specifics of the construction, because again, we want to make sure that if you are deliberately making a collection point as opposed to using a naturally formed one, that you don't accidentally render it ritually impure. And then we're also going to talk about, in due course of time, the usage of the mikveh. How does one use a mikveh in a way that will allow the mikveh to render that person ritually pure? But all of that will take a long way to go. All right. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. It is great to be back studying Mishnah together. Again, I apologize for swapping out, but I think some of the concepts here will do us a lot of good when we get into